Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Hi everybody, my name is Jasdeep Singh, and I'm starting this video series for a number of reasons. So those who know me know that I have an interest in pre-colonial Sikh thought, the Sikh faith, sometimes called Sikhism in the West. And a little while ago, I was talking to somebody, and he was expressing his frustration because he was born into a Sikh family. He understood Punjabi to a certain degree, but he was born in the West, and he felt like the knowledge that he wanted to access, the wisdom that he wanted to access from the Sikh faith, he felt like it was inaccessible to him for a number of reasons. And so I felt the same. And basically, what I did was I started on this journey where I'm not an expert by any means, but I'm just trying to learn, trying to stumble along. And sometimes I come across interesting things and I mention them to people, and people are like, well, why don't you share that? Or why don't you put it on the internet? So here we are on the internet. So the hope is that um, other people who might be intimidated to start learning about the Sikh faith, either if they're born into a Sikh family or they're from outside the faith and they're just curious about what the faith is about, it can seem intimidating. But if you see someone like such as myself, who is not an expert but is slowly trying, and I stumble along and I make mistakes, the hope is it might, I don't want to say inspire, but it might motivate other people to start on their own journey. So that being said, so let me just look at my notes. So number one, as I said, I'm not a scholar, but what I am trying to do is direct you to actual scholars that we have in the faith that are often neglected. We have people with immense knowledge who have been studying for decades, lifetimes even, but we just neglect them. Um, I'm here to introduce you to some new stuff that you might not have heard of before. And like I said, I'm here to learn. And then hopefully, as I learn and I stumble and I make mistakes, the hope is that you might be inclined to start your own journey. Okay, so that being said, now I have a methodology that kind of developed, so to speak, on how I interpret a lot of these pre-colonial Sikh ideas and texts. So what I do is I take the original text, be it Gurbani, be it a historical text, and I'll read the text and then I'll find what's called like a steek, which is a translation. So I started with English translations. They're an okay place to start, but what ends up happening is you learn very quickly that they're very limited and sometimes they're even misleading. And one of the problems that we have today is that so many people rely on English translations, and then sometimes you don't get the context, you get misinformation, and it can be very problematic, as I found out very quickly. But if you need a place to start, I mean, that's the place, if English is your first language or that's the language that you're most familiar with, that's where you can start. But you have to move on to the Punjabi very quickly. And I don't want to say very quickly, but as best you can so that you can really get a scholarly perspective, because most of our work is in Punjabi, most of the scholarship that we have that's been passed down for generations. Okay? So what I do is, like I said, I'll take the original text, I'll take a commentary or translation from a trusted source, like a steek. So that's very ambiguous. How do you know what a trusted source is? As you go along, you quickly develop, you find out that the sources that people have used for generations, those tend to be the trusted ones. But again, it can be tricky. Then what I'll do is once I have that and I've read the original text, I've read a commentary on it that provides context and translations, I'll find some kind of audio commentary, like a katha, again, from a trusted source. Now, that's very difficult because how do you know who is trusted? And there are so many people out there with so many different perspectives. But like I said, as you go along, excuse me, what you find out very quickly is you can see, as you become familiar with the material, you can tell who is also familiar with it and who's actually studied material. And then you can also tell who perhaps hasn't studied it, but they're just trying to, I guess maybe wing it for their own personal reasons. So that leads you to figuring out who you can trust and whose opinions and interpretations have some kind of merit, and who is just somebody that might be basically making up stuff, right? Because we do have this problem in the Sikh faith where a lot of people, without studying and reviewing the material, they just make up stuff. So that being said, hold on just one second, please. Okay, so that's a blooper. So that being said, the video series that I'm going to start right now, it's a very specific topic. I'm going to talk about different issues concerning women in the Sikh faith. Now, why is that important? Okay, so like I said, so see here we have like another blooper. That's my phone telling me I have an appointment. Okay, so like I said, I'm not very well to do. I'm just trying to do my best. So you'll come across bloopers and things like that quite often. So women in the Sikh faith. So number one, there's an issue with accessibility. So a lot of women have, I guess they've expressed concern because when a scholar does come to town, so for example, at a retreat, a camp, or so on, like a respected scholar, they're often surrounded by a group of men. And that can be very intimidating for women to break into that circle, right? They just don't have that accessibility. So, for example, women have often come to me at camps and retreats and they're like, we have questions we want to ask. Can you introduce us to that scholar, right? So, what ends up happening is that because women are sometimes not in those spaces, their concerns, their questions aren't addressed or answered. And so what happens is you have a lot of disinformation, you have a lot of opinions from people that might not necessarily be based on actual scholarship and studying the material. And that's been very problematic. Now, the other thing is that, and I feel like this is a huge problem, if you look at social media, there's this culture around, in basically all societies, right? There's this culture around attacking women, of denigrating them, of putting them down, of ostracizing them, pushing them away. And this has crept into Sikh spaces in social media as well. And so what ends up happening is that you have these accounts and people have different names for them. They call them IT bots. They call them fake accounts. They call them trolls. Sometimes they're real accounts, but basically that's their job. They go and they find women who have some kind of connection to the Sikh faith and they attack those women. They insult them, they denigrate them, degrade them. And basically the goal of these fake accounts is to push women away from the faith. And they've developed a culture where now you have actual real accounts as well, pursuing that same culture of basically attacking women online. And what ends up happening is a lot of women from the Sikh faith, they step back. Either they'll, I guess they'll distance themselves from the faith. They'll stop practicing the faith altogether. That's something that's happening more and more and more. And what ends up happening is, so there's a tradition in the Sikh faith that women are integral to the promotion of the faith. They're very integral to the survival of the faith. So when these fake accounts, these IT bots, these trolls, they're making women move away from the faith, then we're at a precipice, so to speak, where now we have to contemplate our future. If all these women are moving away from the faith, then how can the faith survive? So that's why I'm bringing in certain topics that are related to women. So today's and my goal is to show you that the Sikh faith has an immense respect for women. The Sikh faith empowers women. It gives them a lot of strength, a lot of respect, like I said, and that this culture, that these IT troll bots, whatever you want to call them, that have developed online, that is not reflective of the faith. Okay? With that being said, I'm going to introduce you to a pre-colonial Sikh text that you might not be familiar with. It's called Sri Guru Gurprataap Suraj Granth. And it's written by somebody called Kavi Santokh Singh, Mahakavi Santokh Singh, Kavi Raj, Kavi Santokh Singh. These are all different titles that this person has. Kavi Santokh Singh, Kavi means poet. And so basically, in pre-colonial Sikh thought, he is considered one of the greatest, if not greatest, poets, writers, scholars, intellectuals that the Sikh faith has produced after the Guru period. Okay? Now, his epic, it's called Sri Guru Gobind Singh. Sometimes it's called Suraj Prakash. It is considered the history of the Sikh Gurus, where he spent years and years researching, getting together all this information and putting it into this epic called Sri Guru Gobind Singh. And this gives us the history of the Sikh Gurus. Now, full disclosure, in modern times, there are people that question his work. There's some controversy around it, which is fine. There is space for that discussion, but if you're going to have that discussion, if you're going to criticize something, you should be familiar with the work. as we see, most of the people that are criticizing a lot of our traditions, they're not familiar with the work that they're criticizing. So that being said, we can have those discussions around some of the content of Sri Guru Gobind Suraj Granth. We have to understand the context that it comes in. We have to understand when it was written. We have to understand that it's written through an Eastern lens, not, hold on, sorry. We have to understand that it's written through an Eastern lens. It's not written through a Western lens. Okay? So that being said, there are two main stakes of Sri Guru Gobind Suraj Granth. So there's this one. Okay, now this is one volume out of many. This is the Bhai Singh one. This one is a little bit more famous. Most of the scholars, so if you go to a Gurdwara and in the evening they're talking about Sikh history and they're quoting a Granth and they're reading from it, this is usually the steek that they use. Because, I mean, for various reasons, right? Then there's this one. It's called the Ajit Singh Aulik version, right? Now, they're both similar. There are differences. There's differences in content, interpretations, translations, even titles and words. There's definitely differences in words, as we'll get to very soon. They both have different, for me personally, I use them both. The Bhai Singh one, it's laid out so that there's the text and then there's footnotes. And then the Ajit Singh Aulik one has the text and then it has a Punjabi summary of what's been said, then the text, the Punjabi summary. So if I'm just trying to read and get like a general idea of what's going on, I use the Ajit Singh Aulik one because sometimes it can be a little easier to follow. Now the Bhai Singh one, if I'm trying to go a little bit deeper, I'll use this one because it breaks down the meanings of words. And you can, like, for me personally, I can go a little bit deeper, but it's harder to follow sometimes because you have the text, then you have a footnote, and then you have to find the footnote, go back to the text, go back to the footnote. But like I said, they both have their utility and people have their preferences. Okay, so that being said, I'm going to introduce you to a passage where Guru Gobind Singh shows immense respect for women. Now, this particular passage that I'm going to talk about, the audio commentary, the katha that I used is Gyani Indrajit Singh Rakbe Wale. So Gyani Indrajit Singh is, in most circles, very, very, very highly respected. He has an immense amount of knowledge, and he comes from a very respected lineage of scholars, some of the best scholars that we've had, some of the most respected scholars that we've had in recent generations. So, in this one, the Bhai Singh one. So they're both in what's called Panchami Dharot, right? Now, full disclosure, I'm still learning about this Granth. It's very difficult to learn and understand. But we'll go into more detail about why in another video. We're going to try our best to make this video as short as possible, which is easier said than done. There's different ways that it's categorized. So in this one, it's Panchami Dharot, and it's the IV, right? In the Bhai Singh one, same thing, Panchami Dharot, but it's called an Ansu, right? So just different ways, different words that things are categorized. Okay, so this passage. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the entire passage. Now, sorry, I'm going to read the first section of this chapter. It's a long chapter, and I'm not going to go into detail about what happens after the part that we're interested in. If you are interested in learning more about Sri Gurprataap Suraj Granth, there's a really great podcast that I recommend. It's called the Suraj Podcast by Jwala Singh. It's available on most platforms. Jwala Singh has put in a lot of work, and his presentation is much better than mine. It's very fancy, but there's a lot of effort put in where he takes the stakes and he takes katha, I think from Gyani Indrajit Singh as well, mostly, and he basically summarizes each section in English. So you get a general idea of what's being said. And like I said, I'm not going to go into too much detail into the second half of this particular section, but definitely check out that podcast. So the context of this section is that Mata Jito Ji, who was married to Guru Gobind Singh, she left her body. Now we don't say that she died. She chose to leave her body, and we'll find out why in a moment. And now the Sangat has come to Guru Gobind Singh. Oh, Guru Gobind Singh, if you're not familiar with the Sikh faith, he's the 10th Sikh Guru. The Sikh faith has 10 Gurus, and then 10 physical Gurus, and then the 11th Guru is Guru Granth Sahib Ji, which is the scripture. So Guru Gobind Singh is the 10th and last physical Guru. And so now he's giving the Sangat, the congregation, in spiritual wisdom, in I guess like in a discussion, in a sermon. Now, I'm going to go and I'm going to read it. Now, just like many of you, my Gurmukhi is a script that much of our teachings are written in. My Gurmukhi reading is, I wouldn't say intermediate, I would say slightly below intermediate. So I'm not a beginner, but there's a lot of people a lot better than me. I'm working hard to improve it, and Gurprataap, I've improved it in recent months, but I still have a long way to go. So please excuse any mistakes or mispronunciations that I make. Remember, we're all learning, and we're just going to try our best. So this passage is called Shikari Istri Tomar. In the older version, it's called Shikari Istri Tomar. In the Veer Singh one, it's called Bharati Istri Tomar. Shikari and Bharati, they mean the same thing, essentially a hunter. And what the title means loosely is the hunter, and also, and it's very hard to translate this in given context, the man who came from a woman, meaning essentially, we're going to go more into detail, but there's a woman and she disguises herself as a man. So the man who was a woman, or like essentially that she poses as a man. So that's essentially what the title implies. Okay, that being said, let's get into this. So remember, we're all going to do our best, okay? So it's called Adhyay Viva Shikari Spirito Mad Dohara. एक दिन कलगीधर निकट सिख सिखनी वृंद श्री जी तो तंता जिनको करत प्रशंस बुलंद चुपे गुरुपत्नी जगमाता देवी ब्रह्म रंगर तज देह अपेवी सब ते सुन के बचन कृपाला श्री मुख ते बोले तिस काला दोहरा तन नारी तन भजन है तन कल जुग जग ईश महाविकारी जगोतरे भजन तराय कीस नारी दया अनंत है जहाँ जागो पीतर पाख खट शास्त्र पढ़ क्या करे नाम जपत मन राखे इस पर एक इतिहास है दया त्रय जमकीन संगत सुनिय हे भारत जिम फल प्राप्त पीन. Okay, so that's the text. Now we're going to go through the Punjabi summaries, and then we're going to try to pick out things that we might find interesting. And I have my notes here as well, and we'll go through them, okay? So let's see. So like I said, Shikari Istri Tomard or Bharati Istri Tomard. We have the Olak version and the Veer Singh version. Shikari means hunter, Mard means man, Istri means woman, okay? Now, that being said, let's go through some of this and see what we can figure out together, okay? So the first passage, it says, Dohra, ek din kalvitar nikata sikh sikhni vrind, Siri jito tan tajinko karta prashant buland. So that's the original text, and then the translation, it says, ek din kalvitar ji paas bahut sikh ate sikhniyan baithe san. Sare hi Siri jito ji de sari shadan di bahut prasansa kar rahe san. So basically one day, the Sikhs and the Sikhniya were sitting beside Guru Gobind Singh, and they were praising. So the word prasansa comes from prashansa, which basically means they were praising how Mata Jitoji left her body. So what are some things in this initial passage that stood out to me? First of all, the word Sikh and Sikhni is used. Now, Punjabi is a very versatile language. I mean, I would argue it's probably one of the most versatile languages. But it is often a gendered language. There's a male tense and a female tense. So a Sikh is a male, Sikhni is a female Sikh. Now, what stood out to me is the word Sikhi is used by Kavi Santokh Singh, saying Guru Gobind Singh used the word Sikhi. That word is falling out of, I guess, common use. In the olden days, Sikhi as a female Sikh was used quite often. It's not as common now, and I found that interesting because here women are given a separate identity from the men. Sikhi, the men and the women, the male and the female Sikhs came. Whereas today, oftentimes women are just not always, but they're kind of lumped in with the men. So I found that interesting right away that they didn't just say the Sikhs came; they said the Sikhi came. Okay. Now, the next part, it says, so, Chope, Gurpatni Jagmata Devi, Braham Randar Taj Deho Apevi, Sabate Sunaka Bachana Kripala Shri Mukte Bule Tesekala. So, the translation, Kende San Guruji di Patni Jagate Devi Mata San, Dasantvar Ped ke Deho Shatke, Vahiguru Nal Ek Hoge Han. सारे पासों कृपालु बचन सुन के सतगुरु जी सामे मुक्तो बोले. So Guruji said, so the Sangit said basically, the wife of the Guru is the Jagat Devi Mata. Jagat means world. I mean, in the simplest term, it means world. It can, in deeper philosophy, it can mean the universe, but very deep philosophy, it means the body. But in this sense, generally, the Mata, which means mother, Devi, which means goddess, the goddess mother of the world. Dasantvar Pedke. So the Brahmarandar, and Gyanendra Singh goes into detail and also more in the by Veer Singh speak, it says that the Brahmarandar is basically the Dasantvar. Now it's a very complicated subject, which is a little bit beyond the scope of what we're talking about here, but it's like the tenth door, the tenth gate. It's at the top of your head, and when it metaphorically opens, your consciousness has a direct connection, so to speak, with the creator. So she was able to open her dasam dwar and her consciousness left her body. Now, and then everyone listened to Guru Gobind Singh when he spoke from his mouth. Now, what's interesting here, the word Devi is used, and I found that very interesting because in modern day, post-colonial Sikh circles, they don't use that word. Especially for women. You still find, like, it triggers people when they hear the word Devi, but it's used quite often in pre-colonial Sikh texts in a number of different ways, which I'm still learning and I'm exploring. But what I do notice is that in modern day Hindu circles, and the word Hindu, there's a context to that, but we're just trying to be brief here. They still use the word Devi. Sikh circles, not so much. So I just found it interesting that in pre-colonial South Asian thought, that women were often referred to as Devi, as a goddess. Okay? So that in itself shows quite a bit of respect. Now, we have to put that into context. Does that mean all women were referred to as a Devi? Does that mean women of certain social standings? Does that mean women of certain spiritual standings? Because Mata Jitoji is at the top of all of those descriptions, right? So that's something that I'm still learning and it's something worth discussing. Okay, so that being said, let's go to the next passage. It says Dohra. Now this is the passage that I really want everybody to pay attention to. It really stood out to me. Dohra. Tan nari, tan pajan hai, tan kaljug jaga ish, mahabikari jago tare pajan tarai kis. So the word nari means a woman. So tan is very difficult to pronounce because I mispronounce it all the time. A slight change in the nasal sound changes the meaning of the word. So when there's a word that I don't know what it means, I go to a simple dictionary. So this one, I mean, you can use any dictionary. This one is basically, it says Publication Bureau Punjabi University Patiala. So this one, from my understanding, is very respected, Punjabi University, but you can use any, basically any dictionary. So if I look up the word it says blessed, blessed, auspicious, fortunate. There's quite a few, but it basically means blessed. So here, it says Tan Nari. Okay? So women are blessed. Guru Gobind Singh is saying women are blessed. Then it says Tan Pajan Hai. So what does the word Pajan mean? Let's look that up, okay? So when we look that up, it says devotional song, hymn, psalm, carol, prayer. Okay, so basically, the word bhajan you'll find again in a lot of Hindu circles. The word is still used commonly. In Sikh circles, it's not used. You'll find the word kirtan is used, right? A devotional song or like a hymn. But in this context, it has a much deeper meaning as well, which we find here. Remembrance or repetition of God's name, religious devotion. So for our simple purposes, bhajan here means kirtan, but for a deeper perspective, it means loving devotion, having a spiritual practice. So that the act of having a spiritual practice of loving devotion is blessed. Then it says, Tanika Jaga Ish. This is very important. It says here, it says, Jugde Ishwar Guru Nanak Dev Ji Tan Hai. So here it says, so to summarize a very complicated subject, which I'm still learning, in the East, they break down time into 4 eras, right? So you have Satyug, Treta, Dwapara, Kaljug. And Satyug, the era of truth, so to speak, as each era progresses, the concept of morality, of ethics, they degrade until we get to where we are now, Kaljug, which is they roughly translated as the era of darkness, okay? Here, in this deek, they keep it as one thing, saying the Ishwar of Kaljug, which refers to Guru Nanak. So what does Ishwar mean? Let's look that up. It basically means God. So Kaljug is where Guru Nanak manifested. Guru Nanak rules this. Guru Nanak saves you. He's the king, the highest one in Kaljug. In this deek, they keep it as essentially one thing, saying the ruler of Kaljug is blessed. In the Bhai Singh one, and Gyanendra Singh goes into this too, they break it into 2 parts. They say Kaljug is blessed and Guru Nanak is blessed. So why? So a lot of people, that doesn't make sense. Why is Kaljug a blessing? This is the era of darkness where there's all this immorality. It's because, and I'll go through this very quickly, and the sneak has more detail, and Gyanendra Singh says that in the era of Satyug, it was much easier to be a spiritual being. But the benefit that you got from having a spiritual practice was much less. He says to Nam Jap, recite, meditate, do all of these good things with Sukhala. It was very easy, but the fun, the benefit that you got, the fruit that it was much less. Okay? In Kaljug, it's much more difficult to be a spiritual being. So if you can do a little, you get much more benefit, right? So that's why it's very important. Never compare yourself to other people. Never think that you're not doing enough. Just do what you can, right? Even if you have a lot of demerits, start somewhere, and over time you'll get immense benefit just by a little. So a little bit of kirtan, a little bit of doing seva, selfless service, a little bit of meditation has immense benefits here. Okay, so then the next part, it says Mahabhikari Jagotare Bhajantrai Kis. I'm going to summarize that very quickly. Mahabhikari, Bhikari comes from the word Vikari, which comes from the word Vikar, which basically means like demerits or sin. So the concept of bhajan, in simple terms, and there's a lot here, but we don't have time to go through all of it. People who had a lot of demerits, sinners, people who had a very anti-spiritual lifestyle, just by doing bhajan, having a spiritual practice, loving devotion, kirtan, they were taraikis. They crossed this world ocean, so to speak. That they were saved, if you want to use that kind of language. That they became elevated, that they became spiritual beings. So again, just do a little. A little goes a long way. Just start somewhere, right? Even like 2 minutes, 30 seconds of remembrance, repetition, simran in a day is a place to start. And then as time goes by, just stay consistent. And no matter who you are, we have a tradition in the Sikh faith where people who were what you call huge sinners died as saints or emancipated because they just meditated or they recited the creator's name or a mantra or so on. So start somewhere. Okay. Now, the reason I wanted to bring the main thing I want to talk about in this is let's look at how much respect Guru Gobind Singh gives to women in this by saying Tan Nari and then talking about Bhajan, then talking about Guru Nanak. So in the Sikh faith, Guru Nanak is considered the highest, right? The most exalted, right? Bhajan or Kirtan is considered the highest act. And now, in the same sentence, side by side, you're juxtaposing or you're talking about women as well. So just by association in that sentence, you can see how much respect Guru Gobind Singh is giving women, right? Nothing is by accident. And it's very evident here that by mentioning women in the same sentence as Bhajan, and Kirtan, and Guru Nanak, Guru Gobind Singh is giving an immense amount of respect to women. Now, let's compare that to the online discourse. You see how much respect Guru Gobind Singh is giving women here. Are women given that same respect online? Not so often, right? Instead, they're attacked and they're spoken to in a very negative way and they're pushed away from the faith. So the online discourse, you could say, is the antithesis of what we find in Guru Gobind Singh's writing and how much he respects women. So why are women so blessed? It tells us in the next sentence. It says, Nari Daya Anant hai, Jan Jag Pitar Pak hai, Khat Shastra Pad Kya Kare, Naam Jagat Man Rakhe. So the Punjabi summary is ਇਸ ਜਗਤ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਿਹਾ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਨਾਰੀ ਵਿੱਚ ਦਇਆ ਬੜੀ ਹੈ ਜਿਸ ਨੇ ਨਾਮ ਦੇ ਜਪਨ ਵਿੱਚ ਮਨ ਲਾ ਰੱਖਿਆ ਹੈ ਉਸ ਨੇ ਖੱਟ ਸ਼ਾਸਤਰ ਪੜ੍ਹ ਕੇ ਕੀ ਕਰਨੇ ਹਨ. So it says basically a woman has daya. So what does that mean, right? Daya essentially means compassion, right? So why is it important to have compassion? Well, let's take a moment and look at a very famous passage from the principal Sikh scripture, the Guru Granth Sahib. And everybody knows of this passage, right? And I always come back to it because it's the most important thing before you can even have any sense of religion. So it says, Tolo taramo deaka puto. So what does that mean? Oh, by the way, this is the Sahib Singh stick right here, right? Some people love it. Some people are not huge fans. There's many, many sticks on Guru Granth Sahib Ji, or the Guru Granth Sahib Ji. This is just one that I had nearby. So, what does that passage mean? It says, Nirankar Rahi Rachi Gai Srishti Dharam Rupi Tole Bail Ne Apne Upar Tika Ke Rakhi Hoi Hai Jera Daya Da Putar Hai क्योंकि मन विच दया होवेगी तां ही धर्म कार्य इस जीव तो होवेगा. So what does that mean? Okay. So when we come over here, did I mention what the word dharma means? I can't remember. So the word dharma means religion, faith, theological system, belief, creed, duty. In a deeper sense, it means moral or ethical code, standard morality, ethics, spiritualism. So people argue about dharma, they argue about religion, right? But you can't have any of that without compassion there. That's what that passage in Adi Guru Granth Sahib Ji means. That all ethics, morality, systems of religion, all of this is absolutely useless if you don't have compassion in your life. So Guru Gobind Singh says here that a woman's compassion is endless, right? Now, obviously, he's not talking about every single woman, but he's generalizing here, right? So the next part, it says, Khat Shastra Pad Kya Kare Naam Japat Man Rakhe. Khat Shastra are basically 6 schools of philosophy or thought from, again, the Hindu tradition. The word Hindu is not, there's a lot of different meanings there, but we're trying to be concise here. It's basically these shastras are what people have been arguing about for generations, for centuries, for thousands of years. Now, if somebody has compassion in them and they've basically um, focused their mind on Nam, which is, again, a very complicated subject, but essentially, man, I don't get it. Um, Essentially, basically, the practice of remembering the Creator, right? Um, then why do you need the Shastras, right? You have compassion, which makes you almost higher than Dharam, you could say, right? That's where Dharam starts. And you're focusing on Nam, you're focusing on the Creator. What are you going to do reading these schools of thought? Now, Energy Singh and others, they're very clear. This doesn't mean that you don't become a scholar, you don't study. It just means that, I mean, we have in the tradition of the Sikh faith amazing knowledge that's been given to us by our gurus. Modern times, we ignore it. True, many of us ignore it, myself included, but we're trying to change that narrative. So it's very important to have knowledge. It's important to study, but all the studying in the world without compassion is useless. Without focusing your mind on the Creator, it's useless. So that's what it says Kara Naam Japta Man Rakhe means. So now you can see here another thing. Now we can start sort of, we have context, we have translations. Now we can start sort of, I would say, coming up with different interpretations. So if Dharam comes from Daya and women are filled with Daya, compassion, then what is their relationship to Dharam, right? Are they above it? Do they need, like, these are things questions that we can ask ourselves. Um, a lot of people online think that they're the greatest scholar to ever exist, right? But they don't have compassion in their heart. I've seen some vicious things said to people online, especially said to women. So if you don't have compassion, who cares about your knowledge? Your knowledge is useless. It's just ego. You first have to have compassion, then you have to develop knowledge. Um, and from this passage, especially, you have to develop respect and kindness and compassion for women as well, right? And what ends up happening is a lot of people who fight and argue online about how much knowledge they haven't studied these things. So most of their knowledge is not actually real, anyways. But even if it was, even if you're the greatest scholar, but you're a mean-hearted person and you're out to hurt other people and divide the community, divide the bond, then it doesn't matter. There's so many people online right now, they're just trying to create division. They see people doing well, they see people prospering, they see people having happiness, and they can't tolerate that. They see people coming towards spirituality, they coming towards Sikhi, and they put in a mean comment, or they attack them somehow, or send them a mean DM, or they create a post to create division and hate, and all of the knowledge that they think they have, it's all useless because they're doing more damage to the world than good. That's my interpretation of this passage. You can have your own interpretation, of course. And then the last part is इस पर एक इतिहास है दया त्रया जम कीन संगत सुनिया है भारता जम फल प्राप्त पीना इस so the translation इस उतरे भी एक कथा है एक स्त्री ने जिवे दया कीती सारी संगत एह वार्ता सुनो जिवे वडा फल प्राप्त होया. So I'm not going to go into detail about what this said because this is an introduction to the rest of the chapter. Check out the Suraj podcast for a summary of it. But essentially, there was a woman and she committed an act of compassion and she got an immense benefit. So very quickly, summarizing this, because it is quite long and it would take each little passage here, you could dedicate a video that's like an hour long just to understand it, but we're trying our best here to summarize it, right? So there was a hunter, he went hunting in the jungle and he was killing birds and other small animals, and he had a moment of compassion where he thought, okay, I'm killing all of these things. Why am I doing that? So then he stopped doing that. He gave up being a hunter. He went to the capital of the kingdom and sought punishment. He was punished and I guess beaten and tortured by the king's guards for 5 days, I believe. And then there was a servant woman who lived in the capital. She heard his screams and she felt compassion for him. So she disguised herself as a man and she freed him and took his place. He went to the jungle, became a spiritual person and started meditating in the jungle. When the king found out that this woman, who was now disguised as a man, was in his jail, there was a series of events. He went into the jungles and he found the hunter, but the hunter was now a spiritual being. So he adopted the hunter as his guru, brought the hunter back, said, I'm going to go into the jungles and meditate. You rule the kingdom. The hunter slash guru didn't want to do that. So he realized that the girl that had saved him, the servant woman, she was still there. He made her in charge of the kingdom and he went back into the forest. When the king returned, he realized that this person was. So then all the armies, then she gave orders to the army, sent them out for various things, again, being concise. And when the king came back, he basically made her a minister. So her benefit was because she had committed an act of compassion, she went from a servant to ruling the kingdom for a short period of time, and then eventually becoming a minister, a mantri, in the king's council or whatever you want to call it. And then the hunter who committed an act of compassion, he became the guru of the king and had this very respected status. So the main lesson here, there's quite a few lessons here, and that was just a summary, and I cut out most of what was Guru Gobind Singh says here. But if you commit acts of compassion, you will get a benefit. And that's one of the most important things. Women have immense compassion, and that's also what I want to highlight here. Now that we have an explanation through an audio commentary, we have the Punjabi summaries and translations that give us context. Now we can start having our own discussion and just start asking ourselves questions. So number one, we have seen how much respect, just in this passage, the Sikh faith gives women. There's many other examples, which if you want, I can make videos on those as well. So why do we not see this on the online discourse? Sometimes we do. I'm generalizing. But as time goes on, there is this culture of people targeting women. And obviously, the fake profiles, they're from this insidious organizations or groups that have an agenda to destroy the Sikh faith. But that culture, it's propagating, it's proliferating, I should say. So why is that? We have all these examples of so much respect towards women, but yet we have so much disrespect online. We have a lot of disrespect in people's homes, how they treat women. Why is that? Secondly, how can we change that? How can we bring ourselves back to the epicenter of the Sikh faith, right? And start respecting women, start respecting each other, start respecting other religions, come back to this pre-colonial Sikh thought of mutual respect for everyone. How can we do that? I don't know. Maybe you know. Now, another question is, why aren't more women, spiritually elevated women, talked about in Katha, right? Mataji Toji is one, but there's so many more. We hear about one, maybe two women, but there's so many that come in Sikh history. Why aren't we learning about them? I don't know if I mentioned this, but it says Bhajanvan Istri Dan hai when Guru Gobind Singh says Dan Nari. So does that mean only women with a spiritual practice, loving devotion, those characteristics are blessed? Or does it mean doesn't matter what your character is, if you're a woman, you're blessed? That's an interesting conversation that we can have too. Spiritual women, spiritual people in general, or just people who have bhajan spiritual practices, compassion, they're the ones that are blessed. I think that's all I wanted to say. Again, I was trying to be concise. There's so much here. I skipped off most of it. I'm, like I said, trying my best to learn. I made a million mistakes. I know I made a couple mistakes in pronunciation. I probably made a lot of mistakes in interpretation, but this is how we get things going. We go to reputable sources. We try our best to learn, and we stumble across, we make mistakes. We correct those mistakes. We get corrected by actual scholars, and then we, through conversations, YouTube channels, or whatever, we disseminate that information to the rest of the community. And then my hope is that we can go back to our pre-colonial Sikh roots. But I mean, that's quite a lofty goal, but hopefully, Gurprataap, it'll happen. If you want more videos like this on topics relating to women The next one I'm going to make, I think, might be about the concept of divine feminine in the Sikh faith and going through Guru Gobind Singh's poetry, scriptures, Bani, and so on. Let me know. And let me know what you thought about this. And if you like it, do the interweb thing, like, share, subscribe, whatever, okay? Thank you so much. I apologize for the mistakes. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.